Good evening and welcome to this, the third of our CHADS forums. We hope you get a lot out of the evening and are able to contribute to the discussion this evening. I'm Jeff Oak. I'm a member of the CHADS Forum Planning Group. Begin with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of Warraparinga, the land on which we gather. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and stand together with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of today. It's my great pleasure to welcome Mrs. Shona Reid and Sally Scales, who are going to be speaking tonight and answering your questions. Shona is a proud Arrernte woman who has lived in South Australia for most of her life, devoting her knowledge, experience, professional and personal life to the advancement and rights of Aboriginal children, young people, families and communities, working across the child protection, young offenders and out-of-home care sectors, predominantly in remote and regional areas of our state. Shona currently holds positions on the South Australian Youth Centre Review Board, the South Australian Housing Trust Board of Management and is co-chair of the Justice Reinvestment of South Australia Board. Sally is a proud Pitjantjatjara woman from the APY lands, former chair of the APY Council who currently works as the partnership manager for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Sally has also worked in the education sector for the APY Art Centre Collective and consults for the Art Gallery of South Australia and the South Australian Government. Sally also is an accomplished artist. Now, after Shona and Sally speak to us, there'll be an opportunity for you to make brief comments and to ask questions, followed by a cuppa and a chance to continue the discussion in the community space out here. So please join us for that. But welcome Shona and Sally, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thanks Jeff, and I appreciate the invite and thanks for coming along today. I am Shona. I don't like Mrs. I'll tell you why, because my husband keeps calling me his Mrs. So I've turned to Ms.
Yeah.
So he
it came out wrongly because I'm old.
Is that what happened? That's because I'm young, I've turned to Ms. Right, thank you. Yes, I'm Shona. I'm an Eastern Arrernte woman from the Northern Territory and I'm very blessed to be on. Today I am on Kaurna country. I've lived, worked and played and I grow my children on Kaurna country and very privileged to do so. It's such a beautiful country and I encourage you all to think about the country you were born on and whose country that was, because that's a part of your history, that's a part of you, and we all have fond memories of times of childhood, running around without our shoes on, playing in the mud. That's all land, that's all country, and it's all part of who you are. So I encourage you to find out some of the stories about the country you were born on and think about the countries you've walked on through your lifetime and think about, did that work? Absolutely. Think about where you've travelled in Australia and the lands you've walked on and what was there beforehand and what sits there today, and not just the stories that were there in the past but the stories that are created today. I encourage you to do that because that's a part of you as well, and I want to challenge you to do that and I suppose reach back into the depths of your memory and think about how it's impacted your life today, because it's probably more than you realise. I'm the CEO at Reconciliation SA, and I come from all those areas you talked about before, mostly with Aboriginal children and young people and families, and usually in situations of great trauma and great pain, seeing it at the front face, working with families to rebuild and to heal. I stepped away from that after I have 7 children, so I think it was after the last one. No, the third one, nearly the last one. I stepped away and said it's time to take a breather from that, and I stepped into the world of First Nations governance, First Nations leadership, and I stepped into the world, I was in Parliament actually, in the Legislative Council working in there, and found this job that was available, and it was around reconciliation, and it was all about what's at the heart of reconciliations, which is about relationships at the end of the day, and the need for one another, and the need to strengthen our relationships with each other, and the glaring disparity that I had grown up with, that I have worked with between First Nations community and the wider community, and what role can I play in building those relationships. And that's what led me to want to do this sort of work, because it's really about, for me, thinking about my role and my capacity to influence change and to think about really from a rights-based perspective, First Nations people's rights in Australia have not been upheld, have not been recognised. We didn't even sign up to the Human Rights Declaration for Indigenous people until conveniently the Howard government at the time did some work in the Northern Territory around forced entry into Northern Territory and placed children at great risk. So Australia has not had a good track record, and it's time that we changed, and there has been a lot of work being done, and I'm so proud to work with the wonderful Sally and the team at Uluru and the people that I get to engage with to think about the role we play as citizens, as decent human beings, as people who are proud of our history and potentially, I hope, embrace a shared future together when it comes to who we are as a nation. I work for Reconciliation South Australia. There is an organisation who I'm not a part of, but I'm good friends with, which is Reconciliation Australia. And they do some research every couple of years. The last one was in 2020. There were some really interesting things that came out of some of that research. And, Sally might touch on it a bit later, but I don't know if you know, but 95% of First Nations people in this country believe that a relationship is really, really important. A relationship with each other is really, really important. 91% of the general community believe that as well. So obviously, clearly, we all want to be, a big number of us, almost all of the population, we want to have a positive relationship together, which is really important. And we all believe, well, a lot of us believe, 70% First Nations people, of the community believe that our world is better off with different types of different groups of people adding to the multicultural part of us. So we believe that our differences, having a relationship and embracing our differences are important. I think if you want to have a look at that report, it's on Reconciliation Australia site, and I'm happy to send it to you, Jeff, and you can send it around. The concerning thing about that report was 60% of First Nations peoples that were studied in that report believed that Australia was a racist country and had experienced racism in the last 6 months. So although the desire to be and have relationships and positive relationships across all of our community, this endemic thing called racism still exists in our country, and people are still experiencing it every single day. In fact, 48% of the general population also agreed, so this is the non-Aboriginal population, also agreed that Australia has an issue with racism. So although we want to have a relationship, we're still struggling with this other bit of cultural and systemic change across our country through our institutions, through our learnings at school, through our conversations in workplaces, for institutions, whether it would be church institutions, whether it would be, Girl Guides, Boy Scouts, whatever institutions you're thinking about, they all have not addressed the conversations around race relations. And I suppose that's a really fundamental thing that we want to think about when we're thinking about relationships is race relations has a huge impact on the way we interact with each other. How we have stereotypes and think about each other or think about groups of people or reflect on singular instances and we generalise that to a particular group across our community. And if we're thinking about building relationships, I ask us all, including myself, to think about how we break some of that down, because at the end of the day, for us to build healthy relationships, we need to start investing in each other. And I think that's why, for me, this wonderful piece of work gives us some beautiful, it was a gift to us. And Sally can talk about that in a second, but it is absolutely a gift of graciousness, of, the words, not only the words are so eloquently written, but the intent of it is so beautiful. It is not even talking to politicians, this piece of document. Lots of people confuse the Uluru Statement from the heart as a political piece, and yes, it talks about changes in federal political direction, absolutely. But it's actually talking to the individuals, every individual in this country, around what role they can play in a shared future together, what role they can play in embracing a relationship that's healthy, and what role they can play in shape a future that we have together so we can, appreciate what we have as a nation. I think, for me, my uncle went to, I didn't get to go, my uncle went to Uluru, causing trouble, always does, and he talks to me, he's 81 now, Uncle Brian, and he struggles a little bit with his memory, But I can tell you, after coming back from that trip to Uluru, he talks to me endlessly about how he felt in coming together and building a piece of, invitation to the nation to embrace this piece of work. This is not a piece of work that was invented overnight. The Uluru Statement is a piece of work that has been germinating since settlement, since colonisation. The words that come from here are and the intent are actually written in in treaties that were developed at the time. Even if you learn about the letter patents here in South Australia, there are similar themes around acknowledging First Nations peoples and respecting land and connection to country, around respecting voice and participation and inclusiveness, being at the table when decisions are made. Themes back in, for South Australia, 1836, resonate in this document that was done 5 years ago. It's, almost 5 years ago. But out of respect for someone who was actually there, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Sally, because it is more important to hear about someone. I wasn't there, Sally was there. But it's my job as Reconciliation SA to enable and scaffold First Nations voice in this space. And I'm so very proud to introduce Sally, who can do this if I can manage that. So if you could welcome Sally. Sally is an amazing woman.
Hi, how you going everyone? So I'm from the APY lands, northwest corner of South Australia. A predominant woman. I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, their incredible legacy to it, and also to my elders who have given me the skills to do what I do. So I work for Professor Megan Davis at UNSW, and her and Pat Anderson, I should say. And so it's an incredible thing, Uluru, which was a gift, as Shona was saying, it was a gift to Australia. It was a gift from 260 plus Aboriginal elders, young people, leadership. And what was amazing about that, because I went to the Ross River Dialogue, so the way that the Referendum Council did the whole dialogues and all of that was amazing for me as a young person and as a woman. So they went around to 13 spaces across Australia, and then they came to Uluru, and I went to Ross River, and how they did it was 60% of participants to those dialogues, which was talking about what our hopes and aspirations were for this country. What do we want? Treaty negotiations, the race clause, all of those sorts of conversations were had at those 3 intense days. And so they wanted community members who weren't a part of an organisation, who weren't a part of a structure already, literally getting to the voiceless community members and saying, I want you to be involved. And when you're a young person and when you're a woman, that is very, very amazing, because it's like, yep, I'm that one right now. So it was great to be a part of that. And so going and being a part of this conversation where, when you see Aboriginal leadership all together, unfortunately quite often it's either when we're thinking about Sorry Day, when we're coming together and, during Reconciliation that week, when we're doing a march, that's the times where we get together. And so for me to see this incredible diverse range of Aboriginal leadership and proper leadership and saying this is what we are wanting, talking about how they want Australians to see us, how they want to teach Australia about our country, how they want to embrace these communities, and talking about real history as well, not just talking about massacres, about how there's different communities that had different relationships with non-Indigenous communities, from the old trading routes that go up to Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. So all of that sort of diversity was amazing to be a part of. And so we then saw the government of the day said, no, that doesn't matter, because we gave it to you. And this is what people forget. The Uluru Statement was given to you as everyday people, because we knew that we needed everyday people to walk beside us. We need those numbers. And I actually think we have forgotten that it's our people power that elect these ministers. It's our people power that drives these conversations. We have literally gotten into a space of complacency where we've got to go for it. Everyone's great about marching. My generation is great about marching or posting stuff on social media, but no one follows up with a meeting with a minister. No one follows up to write a letter. No one does that anymore to say, hang on, this is the things that we need to be doing. Those grassroots little things that everyone knows and should and could be doing. I literally never go on script, by the way, so there's no point really calling that. So what we're asked is that we want a referendum. And so we've got a referendum, so both parties have said that they will call for a referendum. We've made them hold on that. With the Liberals, they've also put money aside for a referendum. So what we need to do is make sure we push them for that. And unfortunately, the Northern Territory, which does have a large population of Aboriginal people, can't actually vote in a referendum, nor can ACT. So we have to bring that out. We have to bring our members. So it's all the states have to agree on a referendum. Also, there's a weird myth around that it has to be bipartisan for a referendum to succeed. It actually doesn't, because we've never had a successful referendum in this day and age. And that's what we're really bad at it in Australia. I think it's because we don't hold enough, but that's my personal opinion from listening to Professor Davis talk all the time. But it's about saying, okay, this is a gift, we're going to take this gift, and we're going to carry this on. So referendum is the first thing we're wanting. And also, I would like to add on this here, there will be a lot of conversations about, well, this First Nations person I know doesn't agree with it. And that's actually okay. Because, again, there's this weird myth that all Aboriginal people have to think and agree and do the same thing. Now, the reason why we're saying a referendum and a voice first is we actually lived through a treaty process here in South Australia. We were the first one. With the last Labor government, they committed to treaty processes. With the incoming government, they got rid of it within their first month. So this is what we know. A treaty process without a voice, without a First Nations umbrella, I suppose you could say, on top, a treaty process will have to be pushed in within one term of government, which is 2 3. If you take election ties out and all of that sort of stuff, you're looking at 2 years. Now, what sort of treaty would we get in our nation if nations by nations can't have treaty negotiations? If communities by communities and regions can't sit and have proper negotiations about what's going on in their communities? That's what we need to be realistic about and say, well, a treaty process is going to take a lot of time and effort, and we need an overall mechanism to support that. And that's the voice. It's the voice which is going with COVID, when we saw it go into Western New South Wales. It's those mechanisms saying, hang on, have you got this in place before you let Sydney go right? Have you got this in place before you get these vulnerable communities crazy? Like, it's all of those going, what is our mechanisms in place? Do we push and make sure? It will make government work in a different way, but it has to work in a different way. I'll give you an example. When I was 19, I went and met with a Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. I won't say which party they were in. And we spoke to them about getting subsidised costs for freight for the APY lands. That minister declined and instead spent $2.5 million on market gardens that didn't succeed. Instead of $500,000 that the community wanted, she wasted $2.5 million. So these are the things that will actually say to these ministers, no, instead of that policy that you want to push through, let's look at what's working in these communities and say, okay, this is what we can embed. We can copy, instead of reinventing the wheel, let's look at what's succeeding. And also, let's stop looking at Aboriginal issues like all of it is all one size, because it doesn't work. Because what works for Adelaide does not work for APY. What works for APY might not work for the Cape York. So we have to get to understanding that there's different communities have different ways of working and surviving. Again, off topic. You really don't need to look at that. Maybe just read that every now and then. So at Uluru, you can see that there was this incredible vast knowledge that was there, 250 plus amazing conversations, amazing things that we were doing. And also, it was very unprecedented in the way that the Uluru dialogues happened, because there's been This is not also the first time we've asked for something. This is not the first time Aboriginal people have asked for being heard. This is not the first statement either. You have the Barunga Statement, which was an incredible statement, which had First Nations communities from the top end of Northern Territory and the central, which was sea and desert people. And you also had the Yirrkala Bark petitions, which were again, and we see how ministers go to that and have a cry when they're leaving Parliament House because they didn't do anything. And I'm like, I don't need your tears. I need you to actually work for First Nations communities. That's my little cheekiness. Got to keep you awake. So the voice will really be, and there's a sequencing to it, but the voice will really help those communities. It's the overall umbrella that the communities go to. Then we're having treaty negotiations and what that looks like. And from that you get then the truth. So what is the truth of our communities? What is the truth of our nation? How do we start to have those conversations? And I'm not saying we pick the truth now, because how can you have a truth when the voice isn't there? If the voice isn't there to talk about it at the table and you've negotiated a space where you're sharing that equal power, you can't start to have a truth, a meaningful truth. There we go. Which one? So we've talked about the proposed referendum will be a core function, and it will sit like the ombudsman for the parliament. It'll have that, that space where it's not a third chamber. That minister's also come back and apologised for that statement, which was great. So Labor has committed to a referendum on First Nations voice. They've also committed to a Makarrata commission, which is the treaty and truth-telling element of it all. The Liberals have just finished their report into First Nations Voice, which is the Tom Karma and Marcia Langton co-design. Unfortunately, there's a few issues in there and we're still reading through it. I haven't personally read it. It's like 700 pages. Have you read it?
No. Read the summary.
Yeah, the summary. They actually are preferring to do a legislative voice. Now, that's problematic for us on a few things. So the large legislative voice we had was ATSIC. And if they go down this route, there's two things that are really problematic for it. If we go down the legislative road and it works, government will say, see, we don't need to bother doing anything more. If we go down that and it doesn't work, they'll say, see, it didn't work, why are we even bothering? But it's also making Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people audition. It's a try before they buy. And it's like, no, it's time now. It's time we started to be closer. It's time we started to have meaningful conversations. It's time that we have a better Australia. It's time that when we look at the reconciliation barometer, when we look at that conversation where everyone's saying we need to have better relationships, it's these things that will be the trigger for it. When we start to have proper conversations, that will be a greater Australia. Our children will fully flourish when we start to have an intense but really hard conversation, but to bring it forward. The Greens have swapped theirs around. They want to do treaty and truth before a voice. Again, I told you why the sequencing won't make it work. And we've noticed that the independents, I think, are going to be the key to this election. I always find that that's because they're staying true to it and they're pushing it and making government, and I think they're going to be really crucial to this federal election. It's going to be really interesting to see how they all play out. Sorry, I like it. I do like it when it's not just an all one-sided. So there's an overwhelming support for the Uluru Voice. 85% of First Nations communities and also non-Indigenous communities as well. There is that component of Indigenous communities who don't necessarily agree, and that's okay. It's fine. We do know our problematic areas with if we were to go for a referendum. Unfortunately, I don't think any of you fall into that, but it's great. And we know that there's a bit more education we have to do. I think some people think that they don't have to because they know everything already, so that's we just continue to have conversations and bring them across. We've had incredible...
Sorry, I did something.
Oh, it's okay. We've had incredible support from health and medical organisations, from sporting. Like the NRL has come aboard incredibly. We're still waiting for the AFL. That's me as a South Australian. We've had incredible religious groups. So FECA has come aboard in an amazing way. Musicians and bands and national concerts as well. And also small community groups like yourselves, they fully come on board and say, well, we hear you and we're with First Nations communities. I would also say that we've done an incredible project, which is something I'm so amazed by. If you go on the Uluru Statement website, we've recently redone it all, but one of the most incredible projects that happened, which is a small group like yours in Sydney, came together and they translated the Uluru Statement into the local groups in their area, local languages in their area. And from that, we got funding to then translate it into Aboriginal languages and languages of the world. And that's gone to, New York Times, the application, so we're up for an award with that, and also the Uluru Statement leadership, which is Noel Pearson, Pat Anderson and Megan Davis, were awarded the Sydney Peace Prize last year, which is surprisingly not actually awarded to Australians a lot. So we've got an incredible gala dinner later this year for it. But it's these things that we're doing, but as I said, with that languages, it is amazing to hear it in a First Nations language, but also to hear it in the different languages of the world, the diversity, and also seeing someone else go, I fully get that, I understand that, is amazing. So I know that's a lot of information I've just thrown at you, but I think the main thing is that it's, for us here in South Australia, we have a state election next month. How are we going to make sure that the ministers that are standing in our areas, what are their positions on the Uluru Statement? How are we pushing that along? And we have to remember that we have that people power. It's about us using it collectively to push it over the line. Oh yes, you can also do this. Because I put my phone away. But yeah, which I think you already have. Yeah? Yeah. Oh, I think we can leave that up with those next steps.
Is that the last one?
Yeah, I think that's a good one.
All right, that's a good one.
Yeah, have a look on the website. There's some incredible content on there. But yeah.
Cool.
I think
Can I ask Sally some questions? Is that all right?
Yeah, certainly.
I know,
Sit down.
She's going to stand up here with me. Sally, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So the Uluru Statement, obviously in 2017, that it was written, there were 3 key elements, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
There was, 2 big elements, but they broke down into 3 areas: voice, treaty, truth. And you've gone through a little bit of those. But can you just, for me, clarify, when we're talking about voice, whose voice are we listening to in this space? Like, is there any thinking around how a singular voice or a group of voices can best speak to the highest power in the country?
So what we've already been having discussions about what the voice would look like. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the main thing is, as I said, that as a woman, you quite often, especially in our communities, you're not heard necessarily. So, but from what we've known from the regional dialogues and from the Uluru Convention, people do want a gender split board. So the voice board, which will sit in Parliament, would be gender split. And we don't know the mechanisms of how many numbers yet, because that is up to the communities to decide. So in using APY for a room, I think it might be the APY chair might then have to have, it might be voted between the area of grey, so that's APY, Cooper Pedy, Marilynga?
Yes.
Marilynga. So it might be those communities having to decide which person is their representative. But the key thing is making sure that the information flows back to those communities. It could be 13 to represent 13 different regions that the regional dialogues they have. The main thing is people want to use the IATSIC membership forms and stuff. IATSIC was the board that was abolished before. So they're looking at the different regions and spaces to go. And also some communities already have their own way of dictating who is their leadership. Uluru Mob in East Arnhem, they know exactly which way their leadership falls. And so they might say, we don't need to have an election, we know which way to go. So there's all that sort of stuff. So really looking at the community's way of their structure and not superseding that, and also then going, well, how do we keep it fresh and moving and making sure that the information flows back?
So it's kind of like, because obviously the British Empire, they obviously brought over their there was a bit of a debate around which system they were going to use at the time. So they used the Westminster, obviously election process, and Uluru's asking for community governance systems to be respected, and that those election powers be utilised, and then communicate to that Westminster system, and basically reinvent the way Australia runs its democracy. Yeah. Cool. Right, can I ask another question? This is how Sally and I do our thing. Sorry, team. Treaty. Right? Yes. So I think there's lots of different thoughts about what on earth a treaty means. Can you, in this space, talk about when the discussions with Uluru, whether it was in those 13 dialogues in the lead up to Uluru, or whether it was at Uluru, what was their interpretation of a treaty, and what would it actually, physically, that's all right, we all get embarrassed by a mobile phone, especially when the speaker calls it out. And treaty, right? So when we're talking about treaty, what was, I suppose, the Uluru discussions and what it was, and what its implementation might look like, and its effect on a community, or Australia in essence. And you have to talk a little bit, because it's complex, but yeah.
So, interestingly, there was a region that didn't want to have their treaty discussions were very low on their priority, because they've had agreement making and discussions with their native title, and they were burnt out by it. But also for them and their region, they were like, no, we're good here. We've managed to get what we've wanted. And, they've said, no. Some communities, very much treaties high up on there, because, when you look at the urban setting, unfortunately, they've lost their connections to country, they've lost their, languages, they've lost that connections to cultural protocols and structures and things like that. So there's a whole rebanding, I suppose, of negotiations that needs to happen. I think, that's why Makarrata was used. So Makarrata is a Yolngu word. It's an East Arnhem word for agreement making. So coming together after a struggle for an agreement making, which is really beautiful when you think about it. You've had a situation, you've gone through a blue, let's acknowledge that, but also let's come together. And also the main criteria and the main issues with treaty is you can't necessarily have a great treaty or a good treaty process when there is an imbalance of power. So at the moment there's a significant imbalance of power with our First Nations community and government. So how do we make sure that that First Nations power is and that all that balance is equal? That's only when you can start to have proper treaty negotiations. And I think it's really important for us as well as First Nations people to think about what is our neighbouring communities, what agreement making do we need to do there, how do we start to work together in those spaces? Because there is so many of our communities who are different, and we have to acknowledge that.
Sorry. How does a treaty benefit the non-Aboriginal communities?
I think the biggest thing for a treaty, the biggest thing for these communities will be for us to have, and this is again goes back into the voice, it's for us to have the power of our communities. To actually say, well, let's look at this and see how this is going to work for me and you, but also it's giving Aboriginal people the power back When you think about the stolen generation, that's a full dismantling of people's human rights. You know, so how do they get that back? And that's gone on for our communities. And the saddest thing about it is that since Kevin Rudd said sorry, there's been more children, more Aboriginal children taken out of their communities and their families than before. So we are literally living through another stolen generation without acknowledging that. So it's those treaty negotiations, it will strengthen communities because they now have the power to do something. Because you're looking at people who are powerless.
And can I just add, I work with a lot of communities, local governments. It adds, it strengthens community cohesion. It strengthens employment opportunities and business opportunities in communities. It strengthens cultural appreciations, shared visions, all those sorts of things. That's what some of the local governments are talking to me about around opportunities and the treaties. Would you like me to be quiet now, Jeff, because you're looking at me?
Well, I think as we get some questions
Yeah,
from the
let's
people,
do that.
people, would you mind taking this microphone? And if you raise your hand if you'd like a question, people will bring the mic around to you so